Wrapping up our discussion of war, we're looking at another set of primary sources. This time we're looking at excerpts from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Now, when we think of ancient Greece, we typically think of it as the birthplace of philosophy and democracy, lots of old geezers standing around in togas. But it was also the site of numerous wars. So we're going to look back at the first civilization in what we call Greece. This is actually Minoan civilization. They were centered on the island of Crete, and their center, their capital, if you will, is called Knossos, and that's on the northern shore of Crete. We know that they were an incredibly advanced civilization. In fact, the palace complex at Knossos contains just beautiful mosaics. It contains huge storage containers for things like olive oil and wine, things that were probably paid as taxes to the rulers, but also probably used as trade goods. We do know that the Minoans were in charge of a mercantile empire that really spanned a good chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean and even went into ancient Mesopotamia as well. The Minoans, we know from the palace center, suffered a sudden and cataclysmic end. One possible reason that has been put forward by historians is that there was a volcanic eruption and earthquake that triggered a tsunami that took out the center, the palace complex there at Knossos. Most historians, however, see the destruction there as being the responsibility of another group of Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks. They are from the mainland of Greece, and like the ancient Assyrians, they are seen as a very militaristic society. They were possibly responsible for the destruction of Minoan civilization and of the site at Troy in modern-day Turkey. This is roughly the 13th century BCE. Between the Mycenaeans and this period called Archaic Greece, we have this odd, weird time called the Dark Ages. It's not dark because it was dark because we really don't have a lot of sources for it. The only thing that comes out of this period, we do see that apparently times in Greece are kind of hard, so people are moving to the islands in the Aegean and over to the westernmost coast of Asia Minor. We also see toward the end of this period the writing down of the tales in the works of Homer, and these will, of course, eventually be the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these stories center around that destruction of Troy. So the fact that these sources aren't really written down until the 8th century BCE, and the fact that these events are supposed to have taken place around the 13th century or 1200s BCE, I mean, that tells us a lot about how historically accurate or not these sources probably are. So let's move on into Archaic Greece. We have a few more sources for this period. This is roughly 750 to 500 BCE, and it's during this period we see the Greeks are really flourishing, they're expanding. We see in this period the Greeks are colonizing the rest of the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. So southern France, Sicily, southern Italy, North Africa, and even the area that today is Constantinople are all going to be Greek colonies. Okay, so it's also during this period that we see the formation of the hoplite phalanx formation, or rather the development of the hoplite phalanx formation. So the hoplites are infantrymen. So they're not cavalrymen, they're not riding on horses. They're infantrymen, and this is only possible because of the introduction of iron weapons into Greece. Iron is a relatively less expensive metal than previous metals that were used for weapons and armor, and we see this allows people from different economic backgrounds to participate in the defense of the city-states, and we see that at first this participation leads the lower classes to sort of accept the rights of the nobility, but eventually it leads to questioning the rights of the nobility. And so the hoplite phalanx formation requires, it's a rectangular formation, everybody marches shoulder to shoulder. There's a really good example of that in the movie 300, and the hoplite phalanx formation makes the ancient Greeks who use it nearly impossible to beat. There's only two ways to beat the hoplite phalanx formation. You get them to break their ranks, or you come at them from multiple sides. So if their discipline is good, they're not going to break their ranks. And so you have to work together. So these lower classes are like, hey guys, we're all in this together, and if you don't at least give us equal protections before the law, we're out. So this is one of those interesting times in human history where a military innovation led to social, political, and economic change. All right, it's also in this period that we see the creation of the polis as the central political institution in Greek life. The polis is basically the city-state. And we've talked about city-states before, where it's a city and the surrounding hinterland, and that is its own state. So in Greece, we talk about Greece as a whole, but for the Greeks living in this time, you do have sort of a vague sense of Greekness, if you will, but your main identity was connected to your polis. If you were from Athens, you were an Athenian before you were a Greek. Same if you were a Spartan, if you were from Corinth or Megara or Thebes or any of these other Greek city-states. And this is going to be very important later on. All right, so classical Greece, this is really when we see what we think of when we think of ancient Greece. We see the development of democracy, which we'll get into in the next chapter. But classical Greece, you know, this period begins with war, which is the topic of this conversation. So, as I said before, the Greeks during the quote-unquote Dark Ages had moved into the islands of the Aegean and moved into that westernmost coast of Asia Minor. Excuse me. These become known as the Ionian Greeks. And so they are taken over by the Persian Empire. We'll get into the Persians when we talk about empire next week. But what you need to understand is that the Ionian Greeks at one point decide they're going to rebel against the Persian Empire. They get help from the Athenians, who, because of their location near the coast, are really good at building and manning and using naval vessels of war. So the Athenians help the Ionian Greeks in their rebellion. The rebellion is eventually put down, but the Persian Emperor Darius decides, you know, I'm going to go teach these Greeks a lesson. I'm going to go teach these Athenians a lesson. So he puts together this huge army, crosses over into Greece, and this begins a cycle of wars that is going to last for quite some time between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. And what you really need to understand about this is that the Persian Empire is enormous. In this period, it is the largest empire the world has yet seen. And the Greek city-states are tiny. What you also need to understand is that the Greek city-states were not united against the Persians, that some Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta did fight against the Persians. Some remained neutral, Others actually joined the Persians. So this really goes to this concept of your loyalty being to your own polis rather than to this concept of a larger Greek identity. Okay, so coming out of the Persian Wars, I mean, for the most part, the Greeks are victorious time and time again. But Persia becomes sort of the big bad boogeyman of Greek history. It's only a matter of time before they put together an even bigger army and navy and come at us again. So the Greeks start to decide, hey, maybe it's better if we work together. Now, the Athenians develop something called the Delian League, which is supposed to be a mutual defense group with themselves and a lot of the other city-states. The symbolic center is the island of Delos, which is sacred to the Ionian Greeks, those Greeks along the shore of Asia Minor. So we see that you have one group centered really on the power of Athens. Sparta creates its own league. This is the Peloponnesian League. The part of Sparta, the part of Greece where Sparta is located is called the Peloponnese. So here's what you have to understand. Sparta has its own political allies. So you have Athens with the Delian League, Sparta with the Peloponnesian League, and it's only a matter of time before these two powerhouses go up against each other. And so this brings us to the Peloponnesian Wars. There are two of these, the First Peloponnesian War and the Great Peloponnesian War. Both of these are wars between Athens and Sparta and their allies. And whereas Herodotus, known as the father of history, is our source for the Persian Wars, it's important to point out that Herodotus was not alive during the Persian Wars. So he may have used sources that were eyewitness accounts, but he was not himself an eyewitness to these events. Our source for the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides, he was an eyewitness to many of these events, and he tells us very uniquely in history, he tells us his methodology. He tells us how he uses his sources, and we're going to talk about that a little bit on a future slide here. But what you need to understand is that this war between Athens and Sparta ranges across all of the territory that the Greeks control, which is the entire Mediterranean and the Black Sea region. So this is not just a little skirmish between Athens and Sparta. This war is very widespread and devastating. And Athens loses both times. This is the period of the Persian Wars is followed by a period of about 50 years of civil wars where different Greek city-states fight amongst themselves. And as we have learned, if you fight amongst yourselves, you leave yourselves open to foreign domination. And this is what happens. So Alexander the Great is not the person who conquered Greece. That was his father, Philip II. He wasn't responsible for the conquering, but he was there participating. So when his father conquers the Greek city-states, he gives them free rein as far as their domestic policies, but when it comes to war and foreign policy, the Macedonians, or Philip in this case, really run the show. Now, Philip is going to be assassinated in 336 when Alexander is 20 years old. There was some scuttlebutt about whether Alexander was involved or not. Nice royal court drama there. Regardless, Alexander becomes king of Macedon, which means he also inherits the Greek city-states. And he unites all of these disparate groups together to go conquer the Persian Empire and beyond. So in 12 years, I think, he conquered just this enormous amount of territory. And it was what the Persians had controlled and even beyond. So really amazing. Unfortunately, Alexander dies before he has a chance to consolidate his conquests. And so we see that the Hellenistic Empire that he creates is quickly broken up into 4 different Hellenistic kingdoms. And they will not be united again for many, many years. But what we do see is that he also creates the Hellenistic civilization, which is a blending of Greek and Macedonian civilization with the various civilizations of the conquered territories. So even though politically they lose their cohesiveness from a civilizational, cultural aspect, they still had plenty in common. All right, so that's your ancient Greek history in a nutshell. So let's move to Thucydides. Now, we're not really sure of his dates. We think he was born sometime before 460 and died sometime after 404 BCE. We do know that he was an Athenian general and that he was sent to basically rescue a city-state that was being attacked by the Spartans. By the time he got there, the city had already surrendered, so the loss of the city really wasn't his fault. And yet the political mood in Athens was not on his side, and he's exiled. The normal period of exile in Athens was 10 years. Apparently they were so pissed off at him that they exiled him for 20. And so he writes, you know, fine, dude, whatever, dude. My family has property in other city-states, so it actually allows me to travel more freely and to talk to people about this war, this Peloponnesian War, and get multiple sides. So he writes this work, History of the Peloponnesian War, and we see that 2 excerpts from this are going to be important both for our discussion of war and for our next discussion on democracy. So first, let's talk about the oration of Pericles. Now, this speech is a funeral oration. So this takes place after the First Peloponnesian War, when Athens has already gotten its butt kicked, but before the Great Peloponnesian War, when Pericles is trying to convince his people to go to war with Sparta. So there are some initial skirmishes, and as always happens in battle, there are casualties. And so there's a public funeral for the Athenian war dead, and Pericles gives this speech. So that's one of your primary source readings for this week. So Pericles, if you see in this reading, he is really trying to butter up the Athenians, and he's doing so by really insulting the Spartan way of life. So the Sparta has a monarchy, there's 2 kings, whereas Athens has a democracy. The Spartan state controls every aspect of a Spartan citizen's life. At birth, state officials examine newborns, and if you are deformed or sick or weakly, they're gonna leave you out on the side of a mountain to die of exposure. At the age of 7, Spartan boys are taken from their mothers and sent to live in military barracks, where they are subjected to pretty brutal military training. Obedience to authority is really just hammered into these kids, and men in Sparta are not seen as quote-unquote mature until they reach the age of 30, and at that point they can live at home, but they must still take their meals in the military barracks with their fellow soldiers. So Spartan society is kind of hardcore. But Pericles is like, oh yeah, well they might do that. We love beauty and philosophy and poetry and drama, and we don't need the state to control everything, and we're just as brave as they are, and we go in, when we fight on our own. They have to bring in all their allies. Now, of course, Pericles is not really being upfront with all of this. The Athenians, of course, bring their allies. Everybody brings their allies. And let's face it, the Spartans had kicked their butt in the previous war. But Pericles, I mean, if you think about it, this is really kind of brilliant, because he's totally buttering up the Athenians and saying, our way of life is better. And if you don't agree to fight these people, then you're saying that their way of life is better than ours. All right, so then our next excerpt comes from many years later, or it's describing events from many years later. And this is the Melian dialogue. So this is after Pericles has died, after his nephew has taken over control of Athens, and this is when the Athenians attack a small island city-state called Melos. Now, Melos was a colony of Sparta, but they had remained neutral during the war. So they didn't want to fight on either side. So Athens just keeps attacking and attacking and attacking. So finally, Melos is like, what is going on? They start fighting back. So the Athenians send a huge force to take the island of Melos, and the Melian dialogue is this conversation that is supposed to have taken place between the Athenian leaders, the leaders of the Athenian fleet rather, and the elders of Melos. And this dialogue really presents some brutal honesty on the part of the Athenians. So we're left to wonder, is this really what they said? Or is this Thucydides kind of putting words into their mouths? But it really shows the Athenians are not the good guys here. The Athenians basically tell the Melians, look, we're going to take you because we can, and you're going to deal with it. So you can surrender and be slaves, or you can fight and you're going to lose and we're just going to kill you. And there's even a quote in here, the strong will do what they can and the weak will accept or suffer what they must. And today we still have a variation of that saying, might makes right. And so this idea that we're bigger, we're stronger, we're more powerful means that we have the right to conquer you is very much part of war in the ancient world and war, unfortunately, in the present day. Now, we've tried to incorporate some rules, the Geneva Convention, things like that. But are those rules always followed? Okay, so last week I did modern connections. This week, just for fun, I'm going to do a history versus Hollywood. Now, you haven't read the primary source connected to this. This is Herodotus. As I said, not really a primary source, but we don't really have primary sources per se for the Battle of Thermopylae, which the movie is supposed to represent. When it comes to the Spartan way of life, the movie does a pretty good job of depicting just how militaristic the Spartan state was. They go a little Hollywood, though, on the ephors. If you'll remember, the ephors are, in the movie, the creepy old men up on the mountaintop with the drugged up redheaded chick. And it's a weird scene. I'm not sure why Hollywood thought that was necessary, because the ephors were nothing like that in the historical Sparta. The ephors were the priests. They were responsible for education of Spartan young. And yeah, the kings had to get their permission before going to war. Now, King Leonidas was not the only king of Sparta. Remember, Sparta has two kings, so that's another element that the movie sort of glosses over. There's a lot of other stuff in the movie, so some of you, if you want to do History versus Hollywood for 300, that's fine, but leave the ephors alone since I've already talked about them. There are a lot of other elements in the movie that you can focus on. But this is just sort of a fun, I mean, 300 is not really historically accurate. There are some really Orientalist and biased views toward the Persians, which are not appreciated at all. But as just an action adventure movie, it's kind of a fun little retreat from reality. Which is basically why Hollywood makes these movies. They're not making them to be historically accurate. They're making them to be entertaining. And that's where it's fine if you understand it's entertainment. If you start to think that this is actually how things were and create or develop your society based around that, that's where things get a little troubling. All right, that wraps up our discussion of war. Next slides, or not slides, the next slideshow, next video will be moving on to democracy.